Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. I'm Edward, your companion in quiet investigation. Tell me, is your lamp burning low tonight, casting shadows across the page? There's something restorative about these still hours when reason finds its clearest voice. Watson understood this well, that truth emerges not in haste, but in patient observation. Do subscribe, so we may continue these reflections together. Now, settle in with care. For as Holmes knew, the world is full of obvious things which nobody observes. You'll find Watson's Margins on Spotify as well. The link awaits in the description below. Chapter 1. The Solicitor's Unease. It was upon a dreary evening in late October of the year 1895 that I found myself once more in the familiar sitting room at Baker Street. He's enjoying the peculiar comfort that only long association with a place can bestow. The fire crackled cheerfully in the grate, casting dancing shadows upon the walls, while beyond the windows the fog pressed close, muffling the sounds of London into a distant murmur. Holmes sat in his armchair, absorbed in what appeared to be a monograph upon the variations of tobacco ash, a subject which had lately consumed much of his formidable energy. I had taken up my position near the lamp with the evening papers, though I confess my attention wandered more often to the contemplation of our quiet domestic scene than to the affairs of state and commerce chronicled in those pages. We had been without a case of any significance for nearly a fortnight, and I had observed with some concern the telltale signs of that restless melancholy which invariably descended upon my friend during periods of enforced inactivity. His fingers drummed upon the arm of his chair with increasing frequency, and twice that evening he had risen to pace the room with no apparent purpose beyond the expenditure of nervous energy. I was therefore almost relieved when, shortly after 8 o'clock, the bell rang with an urgency that suggested business of some import. Mrs. Hudson appeared at our door within moments, bearing a card upon her salver. Holmes glanced at it with that sudden keen interest which transformed his entire countenance from languid repose to alert attention. "Mr. Alistair Penrith," he read aloud. "Gray's Inn, a solicitor, Watson, and one of some standing, if I am not mistaken. Show him up at once, Mrs. Hudson." Our visitor proved to be a gentleman of perhaps 55 years, distinguished in appearance and attired with the sober elegance befitting his profession. Yet as he entered our sitting-room, I observed at once that his composure was severely tried. His face, though well-formed and bearing the stamp of intelligence, was pale and drawn, and his eyes carried a hunted expression quite at odds with his otherwise dignified bearing. He clutched his hat with both hands, and I noted that his fingers trembled slightly. "Mr. Holmes," he began, his voice betraying an anxiety he struggled to master, "I have come to you upon a matter of the utmost delicacy. I am aware that your services are sought in cases of singular complexity, and I believe mine qualifies most distressingly for that description." "Pray be seated, Mr. Penrith," Holmes replied, gesturing to the chair opposite his. "This is my friend and colleague Dr. Watson, in whose discretion you may place absolute confidence. I perceive that you have come directly from your chambers, that you are a man of methodical habits, who rarely deviates from established routine, and that something which occurred earlier this afternoon has disturbed you profoundly. Am I correct in these assumptions?" Our visitor started visibly, and a faint colour rose to his cheeks. "Your reputation does not exaggerate your powers, Mr. Holmes. Yes, you are quite correct. I left my chambers not 20 minutes ago, having remained there far later than is my custom, attempting to make sense of a matter that defies all rational explanation." "Then let us hear it without delay," said Holmes, settling back into his chair and pressing his fingertips together in that characteristic attitude which I had learned to associate with his most intense concentration. "I find that anxiety is rarely diminished by circumlocution." Mr. Penrith drew a deep breath and appeared to gather his thoughts. "I have been a solicitor for more than 30 years, Mr. Holmes. and in that time I have handled matters of considerable importance and delicacy. I pride myself upon my discretion and my methodical approach to the law. What I am about to relate may seem trivial to you, but I assure you it has shaken the very foundations of my professional confidence." He paused, and I saw Holmes gesture for him to continue. "3 days ago," Penrith resumed, "I was approached by a colleague with a query regarding an old case, one that was concluded some 25 years past. The inquiry was casual, merely a point of historical interest concerning procedure. I assured my colleague that I would consult the relevant documents. The case in question was sealed, Mr. Holmes, as certain cases are when they touch upon matters deemed sensitive by the court. I had been peripherally involved in my youth, serving as a junior clerk to the principal solicitor." "And you discovered that these documents were missing?" Holmes prompted. "Not immediately," said Penrith. "I first made inquiries through the proper channels, requesting access through the established procedure. When I was informed that the docket could not be located, I assumed mere administrative oversight. Now, such things occur, after all, even in the best regulated institutions. But when I pressed the matter, when I personally attended the records office to investigate, I discovered something far more troubling." He leaned forward, his voice dropping almost to a whisper. "The docket has vanished, Mr. Holmes. Not merely mislaid, but removed with such care and precision that one might almost believe it had never existed. The index shows it should be there. The records indicate it was filed and sealed according to proper form. Yet when one searches for it, there is nothing but an empty space where decades of careful preservation should have kept it safe." "You say it was sealed," Holmes observed. "By whose authority?" Here our visitor hesitated, and I marked a distinct unease in his manner. "That is one of the peculiarities of the matter. The seal was applied under somewhat irregular circumstances. The case itself concerned allegations of fraud and perjury, but it was concluded swiftly, perhaps too swiftly, and the records were sealed almost immediately thereafter. I confess I paid little attention at the time, being merely a clerk, but now, looking back, there were aspects of the proceeding that strike me as highly unusual." "And you believe this disappearance is not mere accident or negligence?" "I am certain of it," Penrith replied with sudden force. "Mr. Holmes, I have examined the archive myself. The locks show no sign of forced entry. The records indicate no official access to that section in years. Yet the docket is gone, removed by someone with both knowledge and purpose, and there is something more. Something that has caused me considerable distress." "Yes," Holmes prompted when our visitor fell silent. "I am not the only person who has shown recent interest in this case," Penrith said quietly. "In making my inquiries, I have learned that others, individuals connected in various ways to that old trial, have also been asking questions, making discreet investigations. It is as though some silent alarm has sounded, drawing us all back to a matter we believed long forgotten." Holmes's eyes gleamed with interest. "Can you name these individuals?" Again that curious hesitation. "I would prefer not to, not yet. I may be mistaken in my suspicions, but I will say this. They are people of respectability, individuals whose current positions would be severely compromised by any suggestion of irregularity in their past associations. I believe we are all frightened, Mr. Holmes, though of what precisely I cannot say." "Yet you are frightened enough to seek my assistance," Holmes observed dryly. "I am frightened enough to desire the truth," Penrith corrected. "Whatever that truth may be, I would rather face it than continue in this state of apprehension. Will you take the case?" Holmes rose and stood before the fire, his profile sharp against the flames. For a long moment he was silent, and I could see his mind already at work upon the problem. When he spoke, his voice carried that note of quiet satisfaction which invariably accompanied the prospect of a worthy puzzle. "I will indeed, Mr. Penrith. Your missing docket interests me considerably, as does your reluctance to speak plainly about those involved. I suggest you return to your chambers and prepare a complete list of all individuals connected with the original case, whatever their role may have been. Bring it to me tomorrow morning, and we shall begin our investigation in earnest. Watson, I believe we may postpone our quiet evening. The game, as they say, is afoot." As our visitor departed, his bearing marginally less burdened than upon his arrival, I turned to Holmes with undisguised curiosity. "What do you make of it?" I asked. "I make of it, Watson, that our Mr. Penrith knows considerably more than he has chosen to tell us. His fear is genuine, but it is not the fear of the unknown. It is the far more corrosive fear of one who suspects a truth he dare not yet acknowledge. We are dealing not with a simple theft, but with the past reaching forward to claim its due. And that, my dear fellow, is always a most interesting proposition." He turned back to the fire, and I saw upon his face that expression of keen anticipation which no amount of tobacco research could ever produce. Whatever mysteries the vanished Docket held, I knew that Sherlock Holmes would not rest until every one of them had been dragged into the light. Chapter 2. A Circle of Quiet Disturbance. The following morning dawned clear and cold, the fog of the previous evening having given way to one of those crisp autumn days that render London almost beautiful. I found Holmes already at breakfast when I descended, though his plate remained largely untouched. He was absorbed in a small notebook, occasionally making annotations with a pencil he kept turning between his fingers. "Ah, Watson," he said without looking up. "Our Mr. Penrith has proven prompt. This arrived by messenger not 20 minutes ago." He slid a sealed envelope across the table. I opened it to find several sheets of paper covered in a precise legal hand. The first contained a list of names, each followed by a brief notation describing their connection to the case. I scanned them with growing interest. "Sir Edmund Velsby, retired magistrate," I read aloud. "Miss Cordelia Ashton, archivist at the Central Records Office. Mrs. Helena Dalrymple, patron of the Legal Aid Society, and several others of lesser apparent significance. Holmes, this reads like a directory of respectable London society." "Precisely," he replied, finally turning his attention to me, "which is what makes the matter so intriguing. Respectability, Watson, is often merely a well-maintained facade. I propose we begin our inquiries this morning. I have already taken the liberty of sending word to Mr. Penrith that we shall call upon him at his chambers at 10 o'clock. From there, we may begin to trace the connections between these seemingly disparate individuals." Gray's Inn presented its usual aspect of quiet, professional dignity when we arrived. Penrith's chambers occupied rooms on the second floor of one of the older buildings, and we were shown into a well-appointed office that spoke of established success. Our client rose to greet us, looking somewhat more composed than he had the previous evening, though the strain about his eyes had not entirely dissipated. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, thank you for coming so promptly. I trust the list I provided will be of use." "It is a beginning," Holmes replied. "Though I observe you have been somewhat selective in your descriptions. For instance, you note that Miss Ashton is an archivist, but you omit to mention that she has held that position for nearly 30 years, making her one of the few individuals who would have intimate knowledge of the filing systems in place at the time of the original case." Penrith coloured slightly. "I sought to provide facts, not speculation." "Yet speculation is often the path to truth," Holmes countered mildly. "However, let us proceed. I should like to visit each of these individuals in turn. Can you arrange introductions?" "I can do better than that," Penrith said, rising and reaching for his coat. "Sir Edmund Velsby maintains chambers not far from here, though he is long retired from the bench. If you wish to begin there, I can accompany you." We found the retired magistrate in a set of rooms that had clearly once been grand but now bore the marks of genteel decline. Sir Edmund himself was a man of 70 or thereabouts, with a leonine head of white hair, and the bearing of one accustomed to authority. He received us with courtesy, though I detected a certain wariness in his manner when Penrith explained the purpose of our visit. "The Cartwright case," he said slowly, settling into a chair by the window. "I confess I had not thought of it in years. An unfortunate business, as I recall. The young man was convicted of fraud, was he not?" "And perjury," Holmes added. "The records indicate that you presided over the preliminary hearings. Did I? Sir Edmund's brow furrowed. It was a very long time ago, Mr. Holmes. I heard hundreds of cases during my years on the bench. Surely the court records would provide more accurate details than my memory. They would, Holmes agreed, if the court records had not vanished. I observed a subtle change in the magistrate's expression, a tightening about the mouth that might have been surprise or concern. Vanished? That is most irregular. Have the proper authorities been notified? We are attempting to understand the circumstances before involving official channels, Holmes replied. Tell me, Sir Edmund, do you recall anything unusual about the case itself? Any irregularities in the proceedings? The magistrate was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed upon some point beyond the window. When he spoke, his voice carried a studied neutrality. The law was followed to the letter, Mr. Holmes. I made certain of that. If there were aspects that seemed hasty, it was because the evidence was overwhelming and the defendant's guilt manifest. Justice was served. Yet the records were sealed almost immediately after the verdict. That was not my decision. Such matters fall to higher authorities. I merely administered the law as it was presented to me. Holmes nodded slowly, but I could see that he had marked the magistrate's careful phrasing. We took our leave shortly thereafter, and as we descended the stairs, my friend was silent and thoughtful. Our next call was upon Miss Cordelia Ashton at the Central Records Office, a formidable building near Chancery Lane. The archivist proved to be a woman of middle years, dressed with severe propriety, and possessed of a manner that suggested she regarded the documents in her care as living charges rather than mere papers. She received us in a small office lined with catalogues and ledgers, and I noted that her fingers trembled slightly as she arranged them on her desk. Mr. Penrith has explained the situation, she said before Holmes could speak. I can only repeat what I told him. The docket is not where it should be. I have searched personally, and I can find no record of its removal or transfer. How long have you been responsible for these archives, Miss Ashton? Holmes inquired. Nearly 30 years. I began as a junior clerk and have risen to my current position through dedication and careful attention to my duties. Then you would remember the filing of the Cartwright docket. Her lips compressed into a thin line. I remember that certain documents were brought to the archives under seal. My instructions were clear. They were to be catalogued and stored according to standard procedure, with access restricted to those possessing proper authority. Did you ever examine the contents? Certainly not, she replied with evident indignation. That would have been a serious breach of trust. I filed them as directed and thought no more of the matter until Mr. Penrith's recent inquiries. Yet you seem troubled by those inquiries, Holmes observed gently. May I ask why? Miss Ashton's composure wavered for just an instant. I'm troubled because something under my care has vanished, Mr. Holmes. It reflects upon my professional competence. More than that, I cannot say. Holmes tried several more approaches, but the archivist remained firmly entrenched behind her wall of professional propriety. Yet I observed, as I knew Holmes did, that her distress seemed to encompass more than wounded pride. There was fear there, carefully concealed but unmistakable to one who knew how to read such signs. Our final visit of the day was to Mrs. Helena Dalrymple, whom we found at her home in Belgravia. She was a handsome woman of perhaps 50 years, widowed these past 18 months according to the information Penrith had provided. She received us in a drawing-room that spoke of wealth and refined taste, as though there was about her person a sadness that no amount of elegant surroundings could dispel. Mr. Holmes, she said when we had been introduced, I confess I am at a loss to understand why you should wish to speak with me. My connection to this matter is tenuous at best. My late husband had some business dealings with the defendant's family many years ago, but that is the extent of it. Yet you have made recent inquiries about the case, Holmes stated. Mrs. Dalrymple's eyes widened slightly. How did you know that? I merely asked a few questions of an old family solicitor, nothing more. My husband mentioned the case once or twice in his final illness. He seemed troubled by it, though he would not explain why. After his death, I thought to understand what had concerned him. And what did you discover? Nothing, she replied. The solicitor told me the case was sealed and the records inaccessible. I accepted that and pursued the matter no further. I am a widow, Mr. Holmes, attempting to settle my late husband's affairs and make sense of his final wishes. If he bore some burden related to this old trial, I wished only to ease my mind about it. There was a sincerity in her manner that even my friend could not entirely dismiss, yet when we departed, Holmes seemed far from satisfied. "Well, Watson," he said as we walked toward Baker Street in the gathering dusk, "what do you make of our afternoon's investigations?" "I confess I am puzzled," I replied. "Each of them seems respectable enough, yet each appears to be concealing something. Sir Edmund was too careful in his words, Miss Ashton too defensive, and Mrs. Dalrymple, though seemingly forthright, admitted to making her own inquiries." "Excellent observations," Holmes said approvingly. "But did you notice what they all shared, beyond their obvious unease?" I considered the question. I cannot say that I did. They all avoided speaking directly about the substance of the original case. Sir Edmund spoke of procedure and evidence, but told us nothing of the actual crime. Miss Ashton hid behind professional duty. Mrs. Dalrymple claimed ignorance of the details. It is as though the case itself were a forbidden subject, one that must not be named or examined too closely. "Then what does it mean?" Holmes smiled grimly. "It means, my dear Watson, that we are dealing with more than a simple theft. We are dealing with a conspiracy of silence, one that has endured for a quarter of a century. And somewhere in that silence lies a secret that someone values enough to commit burglary to protect." He quickened his pace, and I knew that familiar restless energy had taken hold of him. The hunt had begun in earnest, and Sherlock Holmes would not rest until he had run his quarry to ground. Chapter 3. The Disappearance Confirmed. Holmes devoted the better part of the next morning to what he termed background research, which consisted primarily of consulting various directories, legal registers, and bound volumes of newspaper archives that he kept for just such purposes. I occupied myself with correspondence and the perusal of the morning papers, though I confess my attention wandered frequently to my friend, who sat hunched over his references with the concentration of a scholar deciphering ancient texts. It was nearly noon when he finally straightened and reached for his pipe. "Watson, I believe we must pay a visit to the Central Records Office. Miss Ashton's discomfort yesterday was instructive, but I require something more substantial than human emotion. I need to examine the scene of the crime itself." "You are certain it was a crime, then?" "I am certain that a sealed legal document does not simply evaporate, however much those connected with it might wish it had. Come, we have an appointment." I had not been aware of any such appointment, but Holmes had evidently sent word ahead, for when we arrived at the imposing edifice that housed the legal archives, we were expected. A junior clerk, a nervous young man with ink-stained fingers, he conducted us through a maze of corridors to a section of the building that seemed to exist in perpetual twilight. Gas lamps burned at intervals along the walls, casting pools of yellow light that did little to dispel the gloom. Miss Ashton awaited us beside a row of filing cabinets, her expression suggesting that our presence was both anticipated and unwelcome. She held a ring of keys in one hand and gestured with the other toward the vast repository of documents that stretched away into the shadows. "This is the section containing sealed records," she explained in a tone that brooked no levity. "Access is strictly controlled. Only senior archivists possess keys, and all visits must be recorded in the log." "How many senior archivists are there?" Holmes inquired. "At present, only 3. Myself, Mr. Cornelius Beach, who has been with the office for 15 years, and Mrs. Margaret Fulks, who joined us 8 years ago. Before that, there were others, of course, but the position has high requirements and few meet them." "And the log you mention?" Miss Ashton produced a heavy ledger from a nearby desk. Holmes examined it with care, his finger tracing down the columns of dates and names. I looked over his shoulder and saw that the entries were indeed sparse. Most consisted of official inspections or transfers of documents to court, all duly signed and dated. "I see no entry for the Cartwright docket," Holmes observed. "Precisely," Miss Ashton replied. which is why its disappearance is so inexplicable. According to our records, no one has accessed that section in over 3 years. Yet the docket is gone. Show me exactly where it should be. She led us deeper into the archives, past row upon row of carefully labelled cabinets, until we reached one marked with the years 1868 to 1872. She unlocked it with a key from her ring and pulled open a heavy drawer. Inside were files arranged with meticulous precision, each bearing a reference number and brief description. "Here," she said, pointing to a gap in the sequence, "between Carmichael versus Houghton and Carter estate proceedings. The Cartwright matter should occupy this space." Holmes withdrew his lens and bent close to examine the empty slot. For several minutes he studied the interior of the drawer in silence, occasionally shifting position to view it from different angles. Then he straightened and turned his attention to the neighbouring files, removing first one and then another to examine their condition. "Interesting," he murmured. "Watson, observe the dust accumulation on these adjacent files. Note particularly the pattern." I leaned in to look, though I confess the significance escaped me. The files appeared dusty, as one might expect in an archive, with a fine grey coating that spoke of years undisturbed. "Now observe the base of the drawer where the missing docket should rest," Holmes continued. Here the difference was apparent even to my untrained eye. Where the missing file had been, the surface was cleaner, the dust less settled. Yet more telling was a rectangular outline, slightly darker than the surrounding wood, as though something had lain there for many years and been only recently removed. "Someone has taken it," Miss Ashton breathed. "But who? And how?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he moved to examine the lock mechanism of the cabinet itself. He produced a small magnifying glass and studied the keyhole with minute attention, then ran his fingers along the edge of the drawer. "No signs of forced entry," he announced. "Whoever removed the docket possessed a key and knew precisely what they sought. Miss Ashton, you mentioned that entries in the log must be signed. Is the signature verified in any way?" "Each archivist has a distinctive hand," she replied. "We would notice if someone attempted to forge another's signature." "Would you indeed? Let me see that ledger again." We returned to the desk where the log lay open. Holmes bent over it with his lens, examining several of the more recent entries with careful scrutiny. Then his finger stopped at one particular line, dated some 6 weeks prior. "This entry," he said quietly. "What can you tell me about it?" Miss Ashton peered at the notation. That was Mrs. Fulke's, conducting a routine inspection of the 1865 to 1870 holdings, a standard procedure performed quarterly. And this is unquestionably her signature. The archivist hesitated, and I saw uncertainty flicker across her features. "It appears to be, though now that you mention it, there is something slightly different about the formation of the capital F. But these things vary with one's mood and the quality of the pen." "Quite so," Holmes agreed. "Yet I wonder if you would be so kind as to fetch me several other examples of Mrs. Fulke's signature from earlier in the ledger." When these were produced, Holmes laid them side by side and invited Miss Ashton to examine them closely. I watched as her expression changed from scepticism to dawning concern. "The slant is different," she said slowly, "and the loop of the double F. I had not noticed before, but now that I see them together, there are distinct variations." "Precisely," Holmes said with satisfaction. "This signature was written by someone attempting to replicate Mrs. Fulke's hand. The general character is correct, but the subtle pressures and habitual movements are absent. This, Miss Ashton, is a forgery, and not a particularly skillful one." "But that would mean someone deliberately falsified the log to gain access to the archives." "It would indeed. Tell me, where might one obtain an example of Mrs. Fulke's signature to copy?" Miss Ashton considered the question. "Official correspondence, requisition forms, any number of documents. We all sign papers regularly in the course of our duties. And the keys? Could a duplicate be made?" "I suppose it is possible, though it would require access to the original. We are very careful with them." Holmes smiled thinly. My experience suggests that those determined to commit theft are equally careful in their preparations. Now, one final examination if you please." He returned to the cabinet and, with Miss Ashton's permission, removed several of the files adjacent to the missing docket. So these he laid upon a nearby table and opened with delicate care. Most contained routine legal proceedings, yellowed pages covered in formal script and bearing various official seals and stamps. Then Holmes withdrew the index card from the front of the drawer, the one that listed the contents. He held it up to the light and examined it with his lens, turning it this way and that. "This card has been replaced," he announced. "Observe the slight difference in the quality of the card stock. The original would have yellowed uniformly with age, but this shows signs of more recent manufacture. Someone has gone to considerable trouble to make the substitution appear seamless." "Why would they do that?" I asked. "To conceal the fact that the Cartwright docket ever existed," Holmes replied. "If one merely removed the file, the gap would be obvious and the index would show a missing entry. But replace the index card with one that omits the reference entirely, and the casual observer might never know that anything was amiss. It was only Mr. Penrith's specific inquiry that revealed the discrepancy." Miss Ashton had grown pale. "This represents a systematic violation of our archives. Someone with knowledge of our procedures has deliberately stolen a sealed document and attempted to erase all evidence of its existence." "Precisely. And they have done so within the past 6 weeks, using a forged authorization to access the records. The question that now confronts us is not whether the docket was stolen, but by whom and for what purpose." "What should we do?" the archivist asked, her professional composure badly shaken. "For the moment, nothing that would alert the thief to our investigation," Holmes replied. "Say nothing of what we have discovered here today. Continue your normal duties, but I would ask that you review your procedures regarding key security and consider whether anyone has had unusual access to the archives in recent months." We took our leave shortly thereafter, emerging into the pale afternoon sunlight like men surfacing from deep water. I drew a breath of relief, for the oppressive atmosphere of the archives had begun to weigh upon my spirits. "Well, Holmes," I said as we walked, "you have confirmed the theft and established the method. What now?" "Now, Watson, we must consider the identity of our thief. Someone familiar with the archives, someone with access to examples of Mrs. Fawkes' signature, and someone who knew exactly what they sought and where to find it. The circle narrows, but we must proceed with care. Our quarry is methodical, patient, and has waited 25 years for the right moment to act. Such a person will not be easily trapped." He fell silent, his brow furrowed in concentration, and I knew better than to interrupt his thoughts. The game was indeed afoot, and with each passing hour the shadows of the past grew longer and more threatening. Somewhere in the heart of respectable London, a thief walked free, bearing a secret that had driven them to risk everything to keep it hidden. And Sherlock Holmes had set himself the task of dragging that secret into the light, whatever the cost might be. Chapter 4. Words that conceal more than they reveal. The days that followed were marked by a peculiar intensity of effort on Holmes's part. He seemed to exist in a state of perpetual motion, departing Baker Street at odd hours and returning with scraps of information that he carefully catalogued in his notebook. When pressed, he would offer only cryptic observations about the nature of human memory and the tricks that guilt plays upon the tongue. I understood that he was conducting interviews, gathering testimony, but the pattern of his investigation remained obscure to me. It was on the 4th day after our visit to the archives that he invited me to accompany him on what he termed a series of consultations. We began at the chambers of Mr. Cornelius Beach, the senior archivist whom Miss Ashton had mentioned. He occupied a small office within the records building, a cramped space made smaller by towers of documents that seemed to encroach upon every available surface. Beach himself was a spare man of middle years, with the stooped shoulders and pale complexion of one who spends his days in artificial light. He greeted us with the wary courtesy of a man who knows himself to be under examination, though Holmes's manner was one of studied geniality. Mr. Beach, Holmes began, settling into the chair that had been offered. I am investigating the disappearance of certain documents from the archives. I understand you have access to the sealed records section. I do, Beach acknowledged, his fingers playing nervously with a pen upon his desk. Though I rarely have occasion to visit that particular area, my duties concern primarily the more recent acquisitions. But you possess a key? Naturally. All senior archivists do. It is a requirement of the position. And where do you keep this key? Beach gestured toward a locked drawer in his desk. Here, when I'm present. At home otherwise. I am most careful with it, Mr. Holmes. The security of the archives is paramount. I do not doubt your diligence, Holmes replied smoothly. Tell me, do you recall any unusual activity in the archives over the past several weeks? Anyone showing particular interest in the older records? The archivist's eyes shifted almost imperceptibly toward the window. Define unusual, Mr. Holmes. We receive scholars, solicitors, various officials. All have legitimate reasons for consulting our holdings. Yet you hesitate, Holmes observed. Why is that? I merely wish to be precise in my answers. If you're asking whether I have observed anything overtly suspicious, I must say I have not. But if you're asking whether I have noticed an atmosphere of unease among my colleagues, then yes, I suppose I have. An atmosphere of unease? How would you characterize this phenomenon? Beach set down his pen and met Holmes's gaze directly for the first time. We are careful people, Mr. Holmes. Our profession demands it. When something goes missing from our care, it disturbs the fundamental order upon which we rely. Miss Ashton has been particularly affected. She barely sleeps, I am told. She questions every procedure, double-checks every file. It is as though she fears the very walls have betrayed her trust. And you? Are you similarly affected? I am concerned, certainly, but I was not directly responsible for that particular section. My conscience is clear. Yet as he spoke these last words, I observed a tightening of his jaw, a subtle tension that suggested the very opposite of the clarity he claimed. Holmes, I knew, had marked it as well, for he allowed a silence to develop, one that stretched uncomfortably until Beach felt compelled to fill it. There are always questions in such situations, he added, his voice lower now. Questions about who knew what. Who might have had reason to access those particular records? It is an unpleasant business, suspecting one's colleagues. Indeed, Holmes agreed. Yet suspicion is sometimes necessary. Has anyone asked you about the Cartwright case specifically? The effect of this question was immediate and striking. Beach's face, already pale, seemed to lose what little colour it possessed. His hand trembled as he reached again for his pen, then thought better of it and clasped his hands together instead. Why would anyone ask me about that? He said. I had nothing to do with it. That was before my time. I did not suggest you had anything to do with it, Holmes replied mildly. I merely asked if anyone had mentioned it. No, no one has mentioned it to me. Why should they? But his denial carried the hollow ring of falsehood, and we left his office with a certain knowledge that Cornelius Beach knew more than he professed. Our next interview was with Mrs. Margaret Fulks, whose signature had been forged in the access log. We found her at her residence in Bloomsbury, a modest but well-kept house that she shared with an elderly mother. Mrs. Fulks proved to be a woman of formidable bearing, tall and angular, yet with sharp eyes that missed very little. Mr. Holmes, she said when we had been shown into her parlour, Miss Ashton has informed me of your investigation. I confess I'm both alarmed and offended that someone has misused my name in such a fashion. Quite understandably so, Holmes replied. Can you think of anyone who might have had access to examples of your signature? Half of London, I should think. I sign requisition forms, letters of authentication, countless administrative documents. Any of them could have been copied. And your key to the archives? It has remained secure? Absolutely. I keep it on my person during working hours and locked in my bureau at night. No one could have taken an impression without my knowledge. Yet as she spoke, I noticed her gaze flickering toward a small writing desk in the corner of the room. Holmes observed it too, and with his characteristic directness, he rose and crossed to examine it. "A fine piece," he remarked, running his hand along its polished surface. "Do you conduct much of your professional correspondence here?" "Some," Mrs. Fawkes admitted, "when matters require privacy or extended concentration." "And you keep records of your work?" "Naturally. I am nothing if not thorough." "Might I see them?" There was a moment's hesitation before she nodded and produced a key from her pocket. The desk revealed several drawers filled with neatly organised papers. Holmes examined them with interest, occasionally extracting a document to study more closely. Then his hand paused over a particular folder. "This file," he said. "It concerns the Cartwright case." Mrs. Fawkes drew a sharp breath. "How did you know that?" "It is merely background research, notes I compiled when questions arose about the proper handling of sealed records. The case served as an example of archival procedure." "When did you compile these notes?" "Some weeks ago, perhaps 2 months. I cannot recall exactly." "And what prompted this particular research?" She met his gaze steadily, but I could see the effort it cost her. "Professional curiosity, Mr. Holmes. Nothing more sinister than that. Yet you seem reluctant to discuss it." "I am reluctant because I sense I am being drawn into matters that do not concern me. If the docket has been stolen, I am as much a victim as anyone. My signature was forged, my professional reputation placed at risk. I do not appreciate the implication that I am somehow complicit." Holmes inclined his head in acknowledgement. "I make no such implication, madam. I merely observe that several individuals, all connected however tenuously to the original case, have recently taken an interest in it. Surely you must admit that this pattern suggests something beyond mere coincidence." "I admit nothing beyond what I have already stated. My research was professional and entirely innocent. If others have also examined the case, that is their affair." We departed soon after, and as we walked back toward the thoroughfare, Holmes's expression was one of deep concentration. "They're all lying, Watson," he said abruptly. "Not in the particulars, perhaps, but in their denials of knowledge and concern. Each of them knows something about the Cartwright case, something that troubles them deeply, yet they will not speak of it directly. Instead, they circle around it using careful language designed to avoid any direct admission." "But why?" I asked. "What could bind them all to such reticence?" "Fear," Holmes replied, "and guilt, the two most powerful motivators known to man. They are afraid of what the truth might reveal, and they feel guilty about their part in concealing it. Watch how they speak, Watson. They do not say, 'I know nothing about the case.' They say, 'Why should anyone ask me?' Or, 'That was before my time.' They deflect rather than deny outright." "You believe they were all involved in some conspiracy?" "I believe they were all touched by an injustice, whether they committed it or merely witnessed it. And now, 25 years later, that injustice is reaching out from the past to claim its accounting. Someone has stolen the docket because it contains proof of that injustice. The question remains, who among them was desperate enough to act?" He fell silent as we hailed a cab, but I could see his mind working through possibilities, discarding theories, constructing new hypotheses. The web of evasion and half-truth was thick, but Holmes had encountered such tangles before. With patience and precision, he would unravel it, thread by thread, until the truth stood naked and undeniable before us. That evening found us back at Baker Street, where Holmes spread out his notes and began to construct what he called a map of deception. Names, dates, connections, all were recorded in his precise hand and linked by lines that grew increasingly complex. I watched him work, marvelling once again at his ability to find patterns in what appeared to me as chaos. "They are protecting someone," he murmured, more to himself than to me. "Or perhaps they are protecting themselves. But the protection is collective, shared. They all bear a burden of knowledge that binds them together in silence. And how do you propose to break that silence?" He looked up, and in his eyes I saw that fierce determination that no obstacle could deflect. By discovering what they fear most, Watson. By finding the truth that they have worked so hard to bury. And I believe I know where to begin. Chapter 5. A Case Buried in Time. Holmes spent the following day closeted in his room, emerging only for meals and those brief intervals when the need for tobacco drew him to the sitting room. I knew from long experience that such periods of isolation signified intensive mental work, and I did not disturb him. It was not until late evening that he finally appeared, bearing an armful of newspapers and a notebook filled with his angular script. "Watson," he announced, dropping into his chair with evident satisfaction, "I have been excavating the past, and a most illuminating excavation it has proven. Come, let me share what I've unearthed about the Cartwright case." He spread several yellowed newspapers across the table, their pages brittle with age. I recognised the masthead of the Times and several other journals of record from the year 1870. "The trial," Holmes began, "took place in February of that year. The defendant was one Robert Cartwright, aged 23, a clerk in a shipping firm. He was accused of defrauding his employers through falsified invoices and of committing perjury in his initial testimony before the magistrate. The case attracted little public attention at the time, a few brief notices in the press, nothing more. Then why the extraordinary measures taken to seal the records? Patience, Watson. The devil, as always, resides in the details." He selected one of the newspapers and pointed to a short column of text. "This is the initial report, published on the 5th of February. Note what it says. The defendant maintains his innocence and claims that irregularities in the company's accounts were the work of another. However, he refuses to name this individual, citing personal loyalty. A noble sentiment, perhaps, but one that served him poorly. He was protecting someone. So it would appear. Now observe this second report, dated 3 days later." Holmes indicated another cutting. "Here we learn that additional evidence has come to light. Testimony from a witness who claims to have seen Cartwright altering ledgers in the office after hours. The witness is described only as a person of unimpeachable character whose testimony cannot be doubted." "Anonymous testimony," I said, my brow furrowing. "That seems irregular." "It was more than irregular, Watson. It was, I suspect, entirely fabricated, but it served its purpose. The jury convicted Cartwright within hours. He was sentenced to 5 years imprisonment for fraud and an additional year for perjury." Holmes leaned back and steepled his fingers, his eyes reflecting the gaslight. "Now comes the truly interesting part. I have spent considerable effort tracking down what became of the principals in this case. Young Cartwright served 4 years of his sentence before dying of pneumonia in Pentonville Prison. The shipping firm in question dissolved within a year of the trial, its partners scattering to various corners of the empire, and the witness whose testimony proved so damning. That individual disappeared from public record immediately after the trial concluded. Disappeared? You mean died? I mean vanished, Watson. No death certificate, no subsequent appearances in any directory or register. Simply gone, as though they had never existed. I considered this information with growing unease. You believe the witness was lying? I believe the witness may never have existed at all, save as a convenient fiction to secure a conviction. But let us proceed to examine who else was involved. He consulted his notebook. The presiding magistrate for the preliminary hearings was Sir Edmund Valsby, then a junior magistrate building his reputation. The court stenographer was one Miss Cordelia Ashton, aged 22, recently appointed to the position. Miss Ashton, our archivist? The very same. She was present at every session, recording every word spoken. If there were irregularities in the testimony, she would have witnessed them. And here, he tapped another entry, we find that the solicitor handling the administrative aspects of sealing the records was employed by the firm of Dalrymple and Sons. The senior partner at that time was one Geoffrey Dalrymple. Mrs. Dalrymple's late husband? Indeed. And finally we come to our Mr. Penrith, who served as junior clerk to the prosecution solicitor. He would have had access to all the documents, all the evidence presented. In short, Watson, every individual currently displaying such unease about this matter was present at the original trial in some capacity. The implications were staggering. I rose and paced to the window, trying to organise my thoughts. You are suggesting that they all knew the conviction was unjust, that they conspired to imprison an innocent man? I am suggesting that they all had knowledge, whether through direct participation or subsequent discovery, that the trial was tainted. Whether they acted with malice or were merely caught up in events beyond their control, I cannot yet say. But 25 years later, that knowledge still binds them. It explains their collective unease, their reluctance to speak plainly about the case, their fear of what the docket might reveal. He selected another newspaper, this one from several months after the trial. Here we find a small notice, easily overlooked. The sealed records in the matter of Regina versus Cartwright have been transferred to the Central Archive by order of the Lord Chancellor's office, with access restricted to those possessing explicit authorization. Such orders are not routine, Watson. They suggest that someone in authority wished this case buried deeply and permanently. But why seal it at all? If Cartwright was guilty, what need for secrecy? That is the question that troubles our friend so deeply. The docket, I believe, contains something that contradicts the official narrative, perhaps annotations made by the magistrate showing his doubts about the testimony, perhaps correspondence revealing the true nature of the evidence, perhaps even a confession from the actual perpetrator of the fraud. Then the theft of the docket was an act of desperation by someone who could not risk that information coming to light. But desperation often breeds carelessness, Watson. Our thief has been careful, yes, but not perfect, and it is in those imperfections that we shall find our answer. Holmes rose and began to pace, his energy rekindled by the chase. Consider what we know. Someone with intimate knowledge of the archives, someone who could forge Mrs. Fulkes's signature well enough to pass initial scrutiny, someone who knew exactly where to find the Cartwright docket among thousands of sealed records. This requires not merely opportunity, but specific knowledge that could only come from direct involvement with the case. You have narrowed your suspects, then? I have eliminated certain possibilities and reinforced others. Mrs. Dalrymple, for instance, strikes me as genuinely ignorant of the details, despite her late husband's involvement. Her inquiries were those of a widow seeking to understand, not a conspirator seeking to conceal. Mr. Beach was not yet born when the trial occurred, though his recent research suggests he has stumbled upon something troubling. And the others? Holmes stopped his pacing and turned to face me, his expression grave. Sir Edmund Vailsby presided over the hearings and would have seen any irregularities firsthand. Miss Ashton recorded every word and would possess the stenographic notes to prove what was actually said versus what appeared in the official record. Mr. Penrith handled the prosecution's documents and would know what evidence existed. And somewhere among them lies our thief. But which one, Holmes? That, my dear Watson, is what we must determine. Each had the motive, the preservation of their reputation and career, built upon the foundation of a corrupted trial. Each had the means, access to the archives through their positions or connections. What we must establish is which of them possessed the specific knowledge and opportunity to execute the theft. He returned to his chair and gathered up the newspapers with careful hands. Tomorrow we shall take another approach. I intend to speak with each of them again, but this time armed with what we now know about the original case. When confronted with specific facts rather than general inquiries, people often reveal more than they intend. Their reactions will be instructive. You will accuse them directly? I will present them with the truth and observe how they respond to it. Guilt is a persistent companion, Watson. It shapes behaviour, colours judgment, and eventually betrays itself through word or deed. We need only provide the opportunity for that betrayal to manifest. I looked at my friend with renewed admiration for his methodical approach. Where others might have rushed to accusation, Holmes built his case brick by brick, fact upon fact, until the structure of truth stood unassailable. There is one other matter that troubles me, I ventured. If Cartwright was innocent, what became of the actual perpetrator? Did they escape justice entirely? Holmes's expression darkened. That, Watson, may be the most tragic aspect of this entire affair. The guilty party not only escaped punishment, but likely prospered while an innocent man died in prison. Such injustices do not fade with time, they fester, and eventually they demand redress. Someone among our cast of characters has carried that knowledge for 25 years. Now it threatens to consume them all. He fell silent, staring into the fire, and I knew he was contemplating the weight of past sins and their present consequences. In the flickering light, the shadows seemed to press closer, as though the ghosts of old wrongs had gathered to witness their eventual exposure. Whatever tomorrow might bring, I was certain of one thing. Sherlock Holmes would not rest until the truth, however painful, had been fully revealed. Chapter 6. Threads of Guilt and Silence. The morning brought with it a telegram from Mr. Penrith, requesting an urgent meeting at his chambers. Holmes read it without comment, then passed it to me across the breakfast table. "Our solicitor grows anxious," he observed. "No doubt he has heard rumours of our recent inquiries. People talk, Watson, especially when they are frightened. Come, we should not keep him waiting." We found Penrith in a state of considerable agitation. He had abandoned his customary composure entirely, and I noted that his hands shook as he gestured for us to be seated. The window behind his desk framed a grey morning, and the light it admitted seemed to accentuate the pallor of his features. "Mr. Holmes," he began without preamble, "I have been thinking deeply about this matter, and I believe I must tell you something I have withheld. It concerns the trial itself and my own observations at the time." Holmes leaned forward with interest. "I am listening." Penrith drew a breath as though steeling himself. "I was very young then, scarcely more than a boy, serving as a clerk to Mr. Thornton, the prosecuting solicitor. My duties were largely administrative, organising documents, ensuring witnesses appeared when summoned, that sort of thing. But I attended every session, and I heard all the testimony." "And what did you hear that now troubles you?" "Inconsistencies," Penrith replied. "Small things that seemed meaningless at the time but have grown in significance with the years. The principal witness against Cartwright claimed to have seen him altering ledgers on a specific date in December of 1869. But I knew for certain that Cartwright had been absent from the office that day, attending his mother's funeral in Kent. I had processed the request for leave myself. The silence that followed this revelation was profound. Holmes's expression remained neutral, but I could see the keen intelligence working behind his eyes. "Did you report this discrepancy?" he asked quietly. "I mentioned it to Mr. Thornton," Penrith said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He told me I must have been mistaken, that my records were in error. He was a man of great authority, and I was nobody. I convinced myself he was right, that I had confused the dates, but I never quite believed it, Mr. Holmes, not truly. And when Cartwright was convicted, when he maintained his innocence even as they led him away, I felt a weight settle upon my conscience that has never lifted. Yet you said nothing for 25 years. What could I say? I was a junior clerk contradicting established testimony. Who would have believed me? And as time passed, it became easier to tell myself that perhaps I had been wrong after all, that the court had reached the correct verdict despite my doubts. Until the docket disappeared, and suddenly all those buried questions rose up again like spectres. Holmes rose and moved to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. "You're not alone in your doubts, Mr. Penrith. I have discovered that others connected to the case harbour similar concerns. The question is whether those concerns spring from mere uncertainty or from certain knowledge of wrongdoing." "What do you mean?" "I mean that someone among your circle knows exactly what happened, knows why the docket had to be stolen, and is willing to let others suffer suspicion rather than reveal the truth." After leaving Penrith's chambers, Holmes directed our cab to Belgravia, where we found Mrs. Dalrymple at home. She received us in the same elegant drawing room as before, though today the curtains were drawn against the grey morning, lending the space a melancholy air. "Mr. Holmes," she said, "I confess I am surprised to see you again. I thought I had told you all I knew." "You told me what you believed to be true," Holmes replied. but I wonder if your late husband might have shared more with you than you realised. Tell me, is in his final illness? What exactly did he say about the Cartwright case?" Mrs. Dalrymple's composure wavered. She turned away, moving to a small table where a photograph stood in a silver frame. The image showed a distinguished gentleman with kind eyes and a firm mouth. "Geoffrey was troubled by many things in those final weeks," she said softly. "The approach of death loosens the tongue, Mr. Holmes. One evening he spoke of a young man who had been wronged, whose protestations of innocence had gone unheard. He said the case had haunted him for years, that he had failed in his duty to justice. Did he name this young man? He did not need to. I knew he spoke of Cartwright. You see, I had found among his papers a letter written years ago but never sent. In it, Geoffrey expressed his doubts about the witness testimony and his suspicion that political pressure had been brought to bear on the magistrate to reach a swift conclusion. The shipping firm involved had powerful connections, and there were those who wished to see the matter resolved quietly. Do you still possess this letter?" She shook her head. "I burned it after his death. It seemed the kindest thing to do to protect his memory, but the knowledge it contained burns in my mind still. My husband was complicit in a miscarriage of justice, Mr. Holmes. He knew it, and he lacked the courage to speak against it. That knowledge consumed him in the end." Holmes's expression softened with something approaching sympathy. "And this is why you sought to learn more about the case? Or you hoped to make amends on his behalf?" "I hope to understand," she corrected. "To know the full extent of what had been done and perhaps in some small way to acknowledge the wrong. But the records were sealed, and no one would speak to me. I felt as though I were battling shadows, insubstantial yet impossible to defeat." Our final call of the day was upon Miss Ashton, whom we encountered leaving the Central Records Office as the afternoon darkened toward evening. She appeared startled to see us, and her first instinct seemed to be flight, but Holmes's gentle greeting stayed her. "Miss Ashton," he said, "I believe it is time we spoke frankly. You were present at Robert Cartwright's trial as court stenographer. You recorded every word of testimony. Tell me, what did your notes reveal that the official record did not?" Her face went white as parchment. For a long moment she stood frozen, then her shoulders sagged as though a great weight had descended upon them. "I have carried this burden for so long," she whispered. "I thought I could take it to my grave, but it seems the grave is not so ready to receive it." "What burden, Miss Ashton?" She glanced around at the darkening street, then gestured to a small tea shop across the way. "Not here. Let us sit somewhere warm, and I will tell you what I have never told another living soul." Once settled in a quiet corner of the establishment, she began her confession in a voice that trembled with suppressed emotion. "I was 22 years old when I took down the testimony in the Cartwright trial. It was one of my first important cases, and I was determined to prove my competence. I recorded everything with scrupulous accuracy, just as I had been trained. But when I compared my notes to the official transcript that was submitted to the court, I found discrepancies. What manner of discrepancies? Words changed, testimony altered in subtle but significant ways. The witness's account, which in my notes had been hesitant and uncertain, appeared in the official record as confident and unambiguous. Questions from the defence that had raised doubts were omitted entirely. It was as though someone had edited the proceedings to create a narrative of guilt, where the reality had been far more ambiguous. "And you reported this?" "I tried to," she said, her hands gripping her teacup until the knuckles showed white. "I went to the senior court clerk, showed him my notes. He told me that I must have erred in my transcription, that the official record was prepared by experienced hands and could not be questioned. He suggested that if I valued my position, I would accept this explanation and speak no more of it." "So you remained silent?" "I was young, alone, dependent upon my employment for survival. What choice did I have? But I kept my original notes, Mr. Holmes. I kept them as evidence, as proof that I had not imagined it all. They have remained in my possession all these years, locked away where no one could find them." Holmes leaned forward intently. "These notes, do you still possess them?" "I did," she said. "Until 2 months ago, when my rooms were burgled. Nothing of value was taken, not my jewellery, not my savings. Only a locked box containing those stenographic notes. Whoever took them knew exactly what they were seeking. The implications of this revelation hung heavy in the air." Holmes sat back, his fingers steepled, his eyes distant with thought. "You see now the pattern, Watson," he said at last. "Each of them knew some piece of the truth. Penrith knew the witness lied about the date. Mrs. Dalrymple's husband suspected political interference. Miss Ashton knew the official record had been falsified. Separately, these were merely suspicions, easily dismissed, but together they form a devastating indictment of the trial's integrity." "But who orchestrated this conspiracy?" I asked. "That is the question that haunts them all," Holmes replied. "They each played their small part, some willingly, some through coercion or ignorance. But somewhere among them is one who knew the full extent of the deception, one who has now stolen the docket to prevent that knowledge from ever coming to light, and I'm beginning to see who that person must be." He rose, assisting Miss Ashton to her feet with gentle courtesy. "Thank you for your honesty," he told her. "It cannot have been easy to carry such a burden for so long." "Will there be justice?" she asked, her eyes searching his face. "There will be truth," Holmes replied, "and sometimes that is the closest we can come to justice." As we made our way back to Baker Street through the gathering darkness, I pondered all we had learned. The web of guilt and silence was indeed complex, but I trusted that Holmes's methodical mind would unravel it. Somewhere in the shadows our thief waited, perhaps believing themselves safe. But Sherlock Holmes was closing in, and the truth would not be denied much longer. Chapter 7. The Plausible Culprit. The revelation of Miss Ashton's stolen notes cast our investigation in a new and troubling light. Holmes spent the evening in silent contemplation, smoking pipe after pipe while the rain lashed against our windows. I had learned not to disturb him during such periods, and so I occupied myself with my own thoughts, turning over the various pieces of evidence we had accumulated. It was past midnight when Holmes finally stirred, knocking the dottle from his pipe with a decisive gesture that suggested he had reached some conclusion. "Watson," he said, "I have been considering the chronology of events. Miss Ashton's notes were stolen 2 months ago. The docket itself disappeared approximately 6 weeks past. What does this sequence suggest to you?" I reflected upon the question. "That the thief first secured the stenographic notes to verify what the official record might contradict, then proceeded to steal the docket itself. Precisely. The notes would have revealed the extent of the falsification, but they alone would not constitute legal proof. The docket, however, containing the magistrate's annotations and the original documentation, would be far more damning. Our thief needed both, but approached the task methodically, beginning with the easier target. Miss Ashton's private residence rather than the secure archives. Indeed, and consider who among our suspects would have known of the note's existence. Miss Ashton has kept their secret for 25 years. She told no one of the discrepancies she discovered. Yet someone learned of them and knew precisely where to find them. But how? Holmes rose and retrieved a telegram from his desk. I took the liberty of making certain inquiries this afternoon. It appears that Mrs. Dalrymple's late husband was not the only member of that family to take an interest in the Cartwright case. Mrs. Dalrymple herself has been rather more active than she initially led us to believe. He handed me the telegram. It was from a private inquiry agent Holmes occasionally employed for discreet investigations. The message was brief but illuminating. Subject observed visiting records office on 4 separate occasions over past 3 months. Also confirmed meeting with Miss C.A. at tea shop near Bloomsbury 6 weeks prior. She met with Miss Ashton, I said, surprised. She did. And I venture to suggest that during that meeting, perhaps through the sympathy that one woman might extend to another, Miss Ashton revealed more than she intended about those old notes. Mrs. Dalrymple struck me from the first as a woman of considerable intelligence and determination, a woman who might well decide that the only way to absolve her late husband's conscience was to destroy the evidence of the injustice in which he had participated. But the forgery of Mrs. Folks's signature, the precise knowledge of the archive's organisation, could all be acquired through patient observation and careful planning. Mrs. Dalrymple has had access to the Records Office through her position with the Legal Aid Society. She serves on their governing board, which occasionally requires consultation of historical cases to establish precedents for their charitable work. She would have had legitimate reason to be there, to observe the procedures, to note which archivists worked which sections. Holmes moved to the window, his profile sharp against the rain-streaked glass. Consider also her motive. She's a widow attempting to preserve her husband's reputation, and, perhaps more significantly, to assuage her own guilt at having failed to act while he lived. She told us herself that his final words concerned the wrong done to Cartwright. What more powerful motivation could there be than to erase the evidence of that wrong? Yet she seemed so forthright in her grief, so genuine in her concern. Grief and guilt often appear identical to the observer, Watson. Both can drive individuals to extraordinary acts. And remember, she admitted to burning her husband's letter, the one piece of evidence that might have vindicated Cartwright's innocence after all these years. She destroyed it, she claimed, to protect his memory, but perhaps she destroyed it because it implicated her as well. I struggle to reconcile this theory with my impression of Mrs. Dalrymple, yet I could not deny the weight of circumstantial evidence. What do you propose to do? Tomorrow we shall call upon her again, this time armed with what we know. I expect her reaction will be most instructive. The morning found us once more at the Belgravia residence. Mrs. Dalrymple received us with less warmth than before, and I noted that she appeared fatigued, as though sleep had eluded her. "Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice carrying a note of resignation. "I wondered when you would return. You have discovered something, I perceive." "I have discovered several things, Mrs. Dalrymple. For instance, I have learned that you visited the Central Records Office on multiple occasions in recent months. You also met privately with Miss Ashton shortly before her stenographic notes were stolen. Would you care to explain these activities?" A flicker of something, alarm, defiance, crossed her features. "I made no secret of my interest in the case. I told you I wished to understand what had troubled my husband. Yet you did not mention your repeated visits to the archives, nor your conversation with Miss Ashton. I did not think them relevant. I went to the archives hoping to find some record that might shed light on the matter. As for Miss Ashton, our meeting was chance. We encountered each other near the Records Office, and I invited her to take tea. We spoke of many things, including the difficulties of women in professional positions. It was a pleasant conversation, nothing more. And did she mention the stenographic notes she had kept from the trial?" Mrs. Dalrymple's hands, which had been resting calmly in her lap, now gripped the arms of her chair. "She may have alluded to them. I cannot recall every detail of our discussion." Holmes's voice remained gentle, almost sympathetic. "Mrs. Dalrymple, I believe you are an essentially good woman driven to desperate measures by an intolerable burden. Your husband's guilt became your own, and you sought to remedy it in the only way that seemed available to you. You learned of the notes from Miss Ashton, and you took them. Then, armed with the knowledge they contained, you forged access to the archives and removed the docket itself. You did this not for personal gain, but to erase a stain upon your family's honour and to prevent further suffering to those who, like your husband, had been unwitting participants in an injustice." The colour had drained from her face. She opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again. For a long moment the room was silent, save for the ticking of a mantel clock. "You are mistaken," she said at last, but the words lacked conviction. "Am I? Then you will not object my examining your residence. The docket and the notes, if you still possess them, will constitute irrefutable proof." You have no authority. I have the authority granted me by Mr. Penrith, who engaged my services. And I have the moral authority of one who seeks justice for a man who died in prison for crimes he did not commit. If you are innocent of these thefts, you have nothing to fear from my investigation." Mrs. Dalrymple rose abruptly and moved to the window, her back to us. Her shoulders trembled, and I thought she might be weeping, though she made no sound. "My husband was a good man," she said quietly. "He made one terrible mistake, and it haunted him until his dying day. I could not bear the thought that his memory would be forever tainted by it, that our children would learn their father had been complicit in such a wrong. Can you not understand that, Mr. Holmes? Can you not see that I acted out of love?" "I understand perfectly," Holmes replied, "but understanding does not alter the facts. You have committed theft and forgery. You have obstructed justice, and in doing so you have prevented the truth from emerging, which was precisely the sin your husband committed 25 years ago. You have repeated his mistake rather than remedying it." She turned to face us, and I saw that tears indeed streamed down her cheeks. "What will you do?" "That depends upon what you do, Mrs. Dalrymple. If you surrender the documents you have taken, if you confess your actions to the proper authorities, there may yet be some measure of leniency. Your motive, while not excusable, is at least understandable. But if you persist in denial, I shall have no choice but to present my evidence to Scotland Yard and let the law take its course." The silence stretched between them, taut as a wire. I found myself holding my breath, waiting for her response. "I need time to consider," she said finally. "This is not a decision I can make in an instant." "You have until tomorrow evening," Holmes said, rising. "After that I must act according to my duty. I am sorry, Mrs. Dalrymple. Truly I am." As we departed, I glanced back to see her standing motionless by the window, a figure of profound loneliness and despair. Whatever her crimes, I could not help but feel a measure of pity for her. Once in the street, I turned to Holmes. "You believe she will confess?" His expression was troubled, a rare sight on my friend's usually composed features. "I believe she's wrestling with her conscience, Watson. Whether that conscience will prevail remains to be seen." We walked in silence for some distance before I ventured another question. "Holmes, you seemed almost reluctant to accuse her. Is something troubling you about this solution?" He stopped walking and fixed me with a penetrating stare. "Everything troubles me about it, Watson. It is too neat, too convenient, too perfectly aligned with what we would wish to believe. When a solution presents itself with such apparent completeness, I have learned to be suspicious of it. Then you do not believe she's guilty? I believe she's guilty of many things, of seeking forbidden knowledge, of allowing emotion to guide her actions, perhaps even of planning to commit the very crimes I accused her of. But guilty of actually committing them?" He shook his head slowly. "That, my dear fellow, is an entirely different question, and I am not yet prepared to answer it with certainty." His words left me more confused than enlightened. Yeah, but I knew that further questions would yield nothing until Holmes had completed whatever mental calculation still occupied him. We returned to Baker Street in silence, and I could only wonder what revelation the morrow might bring. Chapter 8. The Collapse of Certainty. I awoke the following morning to find Holmes already dressed and seated at the breakfast table, though he had evidently consumed nothing more substantial than coffee. Before him lay several sheets of paper covered with his characteristic angular notations, and his expression bore that peculiar intensity which indicated a mind wholly absorbed in intellectual pursuit. "Watson," he said without looking up, "I have spent the night reviewing our evidence against Mrs. Dalrymple, and I find it wanting in several crucial particulars. I believe we have been led astray by the very sympathy she evokes." "Led astray?" I said, taking my seat. "But surely the evidence—" "The evidence is circumstantial at best, and, upon closer examination, actively contradictory at worst. Sit, have your breakfast, and allow me to demonstrate the flaws in our reasoning." He pushed aside his notes and steepled his fingers, a gesture I had come to recognize as the prelude to systematic exposition. "First, Consider the technical aspects of the theft. The forger who signed Mrs. Fulks's name in the access log possessed sufficient skill to pass initial scrutiny, yet Miss Ashton's trained eye detected the deception almost immediately upon careful comparison. This suggests someone with legal or clerical experience, someone familiar with the formation of official signatures. Mrs. Dalrymple's background provides no evidence of such expertise. She's a woman of society, educated certainly, but not in the minutiae of archival procedure or the reproduction of another's hand. She might have practiced, I suggested. Practice leaves traces, Watson. One does not achieve even moderate competence at forgery without producing numerous failed attempts. Where are these attempts? We found no such evidence when we visited her home, and her emotional state during our interview suggested genuine distress rather than calculated performance. He rose and began to pace, his energy rekindled by the chase. Second, consider the matter of access. Mrs. Dalrymple visited the records office on 4 occasions over 3 months. But on none of these occasions, according to the log which I have since examined in detail, did she request access to the sealed records section. Her visits were properly documented, her purposes legitimate and verifiable. She consulted cases relating to the Legal Aid Society's work, nothing more. But the private meeting with Miss Ashton proves only that they met, not that Miss Ashton revealed the location of her notes. Consider the timeline, Watson. The notes were stolen 2 months ago. The meeting occurred 6 weeks ago. The sequence is wrong. If Mrs. Dalrymple learned of the notes during their tea, she would have acted more swiftly. The gap suggests either that the information came from another source entirely, or that the thief was someone who already knew of the note's existence and required no intelligence from Miss Ashton. I confess this logic troubled me, for it undermined what had seemed a convincing solution. Then who could have known about the notes? That is the question I had been pondering all night. Miss Ashton kept their existence secret for 25 years, mentioning them to no one, yet someone learned of them. How? The answer, I believe, lies not in what Miss Ashton told others, but in what others observed. He returned to his seat and withdrew a fresh sheet of paper. I made inquiries yesterday evening while you were at your club. It appears that Miss Ashton's rooms were under observation for some weeks before the burglary. A neighbour reported seeing a gentleman loitering in the street on several occasions, apparently waiting and watching. A description? Vague, unfortunately. Middle-aged, well-dressed, with the bearing of professional class. The description could fit half of London, but the behaviour is instructive. Someone was conducting surveillance, Watson, learning Miss Ashton's habits, determining when her rooms would be unoccupied. This speaks to methodical planning of a high order. Mrs. Dalrymple could have hired such a person. She could have, yes. But there is another problem, one I confess troubled me from the moment I made the accusation. Mrs. Dalrymple's emotional response to my questions about her husband's guilt was entirely genuine. Grief cannot be counterfeited with such conviction, particularly not the kind of grief that springs from helpless witness to a loved one's torment. She knew her husband suffered from his complicity, but she did not know the specific details of what had been done. Her questions to the old family solicitor, her visits to the archives, these were the actions of one seeking information, as not one attempting to conceal it. He drew a document from among his papers and passed it to me. This is the log entry for the day the docket was stolen. Observe Mrs. Fulke's forged signature. Now compare it to these authenticated examples I obtained from the records office. I studied both sets of documents carefully. The forgery was competent but not perfect, as Holmes had noted. But it was the authenticated signatures that now drew my attention, for I observed something I had not noticed before. The pressure of the pen varies, I said slowly. In the genuine signatures, Mrs. Fulks bears down more heavily on the downward strokes. The forgery is more uniform in its pressure. Excellent, Watson. You have identified precisely what troubled me. This forgery was executed by someone who observed the form of Mrs. Fulks' signature, but not its dynamics. They copied what they saw, but could not replicate what they had not observed. the physical act of writing itself. This suggests someone working from a static example, a piece of paper bearing her signature, rather than someone who had watched her sign documents repeatedly. But who would have such an example? Anyone who had corresponded officially with her? Anyone who had received documents she had authenticated? The circle widens considerably. But now observe this. He produced another document, one I recognised as the index card that had been replaced in the archive. When I examined this card previously, I noted that it was of more recent manufacture than the original, but I failed to observe something else until last night. Whoa, when I compared it to other index cards from the same period. He held the card up to the light streaming through our window. The handwriting on this replacement card matches none of the archivists currently employed at the records office. I obtained samples from Miss Ashton, Mr. Beach, and Mrs. Fulkeys. None correspond. But observe the formation of the capital letters, particularly the ornate flourish on the C of Cartwright. This is an older style of penmanship, one taught some 40 or 50 years ago. The implication struck me with considerable force. Someone from an earlier generation wrote this replacement, or someone trained in an older style, and that, Watson, narrows our field dramatically. Of all our suspects, only one possesses both the age and the training to write in such a manner. Only one would have had intimate knowledge of what the original docket contained, and only one possessed the authority and access to manipulate records without arousing immediate suspicion. Sir Edmund Vailsby, I breathed. Precisely. The retired magistrate who presided over the preliminary hearings 25 years ago. Consider what we know of him. He was defensive when we first spoke, too quick to insist that the law had been followed to the letter. His chambers, though genteel, showed signs of financial difficulty, the kind of difficulty that might arise from decades of conscience, money paid to maintain silence or from blackmail, threatened by those who knew of his complicity. Holmes rose and retrieved his coat. Mrs. Dalrymple's grief was genuine because she was genuinely innocent of the theft, though not of the desire to protect her husband's memory. We were meant to suspect her, Watson. Her visits to the archives, her meeting with Miss Ashton, her emotional investment in the case, all of these made her the perfect scapegoat for one who understood how to manipulate suspicion. But how can we prove it? By confronting Sir Edmund with evidence he cannot refute. I had young Wiggins make certain inquiries in the neighbourhood of Vailsby's chambers yesterday. It seems the good magistrate has been absent from his usual haunts on several occasions matching the dates of suspicious activity. More tellingly, a stationer's shop near Gray's Inn recalls selling him a quantity of cardstock, matching the type used for archive index cards some 8 weeks ago. A curious purchase for a retired magistrate with no administrative duties. He checked his watch. We have just time to call upon Mrs. Dalrymple and offer our apologies before confronting Sir Edmund. I dislike leaving that good woman under a shadow of suspicion for even an hour longer than necessary. Mrs. Dalrymple received us with evident trepidation, but her expression transformed to one of profound relief when Holmes explained that we had been in error. Tears came to her eyes, though whether from relief or the residue of yesterday's anguish I could not say. I considered confessing to something I had not done, she admitted. If it would preserve my husband's memory and end this nightmare, I thought perhaps it would be worth the sacrifice. Never confess to crimes you have not committed, Mrs. Dalrymple, Holmes said gently. The truth has a way of emerging despite our best efforts to suppress it. Your husband's memory would have been better served by your innocence than by your martyrdom. As we departed, I reflected on how close we'd come to a grave injustice, how easily emotion and circumstance could combine to mislead even so keen an intelligence as Holmes's. It was a sobering reminder that the pursuit of truth required not merely logic, but also the wisdom to question one's own conclusions. You said earlier that something troubled you about the solution, I remarked as we made our way towards Sir Edmund's chambers. What was it specifically that caused you to doubt? Holmes smiled grimly. The very completeness of it, Watson. In my experience, the truth is rarely so accommodating as to present itself with all its elements neatly aligned. When a solution appears too perfect, when it satisfies too completely our expectations and prejudices, that is precisely when we must examine it most rigorously. Mrs. Dalrymple fit our image of the desperate widow driven to crime by love and grief. But that image was a construction, not a reality, and constructions, however elegant, crumble when subjected to the weight of facts. We had arrived at Sir Edmund's door. Holmes straightened his shoulders, and I saw in his eyes that cold determination which presaged the final confrontation. "Now," he said quietly, "let us discover what truths a magistrate holds more dear than justice itself." Chapter 9. The Past Revealed. Sir Edmund Vailsby's chambers appeared unchanged from our previous visit, though perhaps the afternoon light rendered them more melancholy than I had recalled. The retired magistrate himself seemed to have aged considerably in the intervening days, his leonine head of white hair now appearing more a burden than an ornament. He received us with courtesy but without warmth, and I observed that his hand trembled slightly as he gestured us to seats. "Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice carrying a note of weary resignation, "I have been expecting you. Indeed, I am surprised you did not come sooner." Holmes settled into his chair with that deceptive casualness which often preceded his most devastating revelations. "You knew we would discover the truth eventually? I knew that someone of your reputation and persistence would not be satisfied with easy answers. When you left here after your first visit, I understood that it was merely a matter of time." He moved to the window, much as he had done before, gazing out at the grey London afternoon. "Tell me, how did you know? Shall I recount my deductions, or would you prefer to offer your own account first?" Sir Edmund was silent for a long moment. Then he turned from the window, and I saw in his face a profound exhaustion that went beyond mere physical fatigue. "I shall tell you," he said quietly. "I find I'm tired of carrying this burden alone. But first I must ask, are the others aware? Penrith, Miss Ashton, Mrs. Dalrymple?" "They are not yet aware of your specific culpability," Holmes replied, "though I have taken the liberty of requesting their presence here within the hour. I believe they deserve to hear the truth directly from the one who created the necessity for their silence." The magistrate nodded slowly. "You are correct, of course. They have borne unfair weight for my sins." He moved to his desk and withdrew a locked box from the bottom drawer. From this he produced a sheaf of papers yellowed with age. "The Docket," he said simply, "and Miss Ashton's original stenographic notes. I took them both, though for the notes I employed an agent, a discreet investigator who asked no questions. The Docket I removed myself, using methods you have no doubt already deduced. The forged signature, the replaced index card, the careful timing to avoid detection. Precisely. I am not proud of these deceptions, Mr. Holmes, but I am less proud still of what necessitated them." He laid the documents upon his desk with a tenderness that seemed almost reverential. "Do you know what these contain?" "I believe I do, but I would hear it from you." Sir Edmund returned to the window, his profile etched against the fading light. "The Cartwright case was my first as a magistrate. I was young, ambitious, eager to prove myself worthy of the trust placed in me. When the case was brought before me, I approached it with all the idealism of inexperience. But there were pressures, Mr. Holmes, pressures I had not anticipated. From whom? From those who held power over my career, from those who stood to profit from a swift conviction. The shipping firm involved was owned in part by men of considerable influence. Young Cartwright had discovered irregularities in their accounts, not the simple fraud he was accused of, but systematic embezzlement involving sums far greater than those mentioned in the indictment. He was protecting someone, yes, but not out of misguided loyalty. He was protecting his own sister, who had been coerced into altering the books by her employer, one of the firm's senior partners. Holmes leaned forward with interest. The sister was the actual witness who supposedly testified against him? No, the witness never existed, as you have likely surmised. The testimony was fabricated entirely, attributed to a fictitious clerk whose supposed character was vouched for by the very men who had orchestrated the fraud. I knew it was false, Mr. Holmes. I knew from the moment I heard it that something was profoundly wrong. The details were too precise, the account too convenient. But when I expressed my doubts privately, I was informed in no uncertain terms that my career depended upon reaching the correct conclusion. And you yielded to this pressure. I yielded. The words fell like stones into still water. I told myself that I had no proof, that my doubts were insufficient grounds to halt the proceedings. I told myself many things, Mr. Holmes, all of them lies designed to ease my conscience. I allowed the false testimony to stand. I rushed the preliminary hearings to prevent adequate defence, and when the case proceeded to trial, I ensured that the official record reflected a narrative of guilt supported by evidence I knew to be manufactured. What became of the sister? She died, Sir Edmund said, his voice cracking. 6 months after her brother's conviction, she died of a fever. But not before she had confessed the truth to me in a letter, begging me to reconsider the verdict. That letter is in the docket, Mr. Holmes, along with my own annotations noting the discrepancies in testimony, my private doubts, and my ultimate decision to suppress them all. It is a record of comprehensive judicial corruption, and it has haunted me every day for 25 years. The room fell silent, save for the ticking of a clock. Holmes regarded the magistrate with an expression that mingled understanding with implacable judgment. "Why did you seal the records?" he asked. "I convinced myself it was to protect the innocent, to prevent the scandal from destroying others who had played minor roles in the affair. But in truth, I was protecting myself. I could not destroy the evidence entirely. Some vestige of conscience prevented that. But I could ensure it remained hidden, inaccessible, forgotten, and for 25 years it was. Until Mr. Penrith made his inquiry. Yes, his innocent question set events in motion that I could not control. Suddenly, after a quarter-century of silence, people were asking questions, making connections, threatening to expose what I had worked so hard to bury. I knew that if the docket were examined, my career, my reputation, everything I had built upon that foundation of lies would crumble to dust. Holmes rose and walked to the desk where the documents lay, although he did not touch them, but studied them as one might study evidence of some ancient crime. "Your theft of the docket was methodical and well planned," he observed. "But you made several errors. The handwriting on the replacement index card betrayed your age and training. The timing of your absences from your usual haunts coincided too neatly with the suspicious activities. And most significantly, you failed to account for the fact that others also bore fragments of the truth, fragments that could be assembled into a complete picture even without the docket itself." "I know," Sir Edmund said. "I am not a criminal by nature, Mr. Holmes. I am merely a coward who compounded one act of moral failure with decades of active concealment. When I heard that you had been engaged to investigate, I knew my efforts were futile. You are too thorough, too persistent. The truth was always going to emerge." At that moment the door opened to admit Mrs. Hudson, who announced the arrival of our other guests. Mr. Penrith entered first, followed by Miss Ashton and Mrs. Dalrymple. They arranged themselves about the room, their expressions ranging from confusion to apprehension. Holmes remained standing by the desk, his bearing that of a judge about to render verdict. "Thank you all for coming," he began. "I have gathered you here because you each deserve to understand the full scope of what occurred 25 years ago, and why you have all carried burdens of guilt and suspicion for matters that were not of your making." He proceeded then to lay out the complete history of the case, from the original fraud through the fabricated testimony to the pressure brought to bear upon a young magistrate. He explained how each of them had witnessed fragments of the injustice, Penrith noting the false date, Miss Ashton recording the alterations to testimony, Mrs. Dalrymple's husband recognising the political manipulation, and how their silence, while understandable, had perpetuated the wrong. But the chief architect of this injustice, Holmes concluded, turning to Sir Edmund, was the one man charged with ensuring it could not occur, the magistrate who valued his career above truth, his reputation above justice. Sir Edmund had listened to this recitation with bowed head. Now he raised his eyes to meet those of his former colleagues and said, "I offer no excuses for what I have done. I can only say that I have lived in a prison of my own making for 25 years, and I am ready now to exchange that prison for a real one." Miss Ashton spoke first, her voice trembling with emotion. "An innocent man died because of this. Robert Cartwright died in Pentonville, protesting his innocence to the end." "I know," Sir Edmund replied, "and his sister died with that burden upon her conscience. Their blood is on my hands, and no amount of regret can wash it clean." Penrith stepped forward, his face pale but resolute. "What will you do, Mr. Holmes? What justice can be achieved after so long?" Holmes looked to me, and I saw in his eyes a recognition of the complexity of the question. Justice delayed was not justice denied, but it was justice transformed into something both more and less than it should have been. "That," Holmes said, "is not for me to decide alone. Sir Edmund has confessed his crimes in the presence of witnesses. The evidence of his wrongdoing is documented and irrefutable. The proper authorities must be informed, and they will determine what charges, if any, can still be brought. But there is another justice to consider: the restoration of Robert Cartwright's name and the acknowledgement of the wrong done to him." He gathered up the documents from the desk. "These will be delivered to the Lord Chancellor's office, along with a full account of what has transpired. Let the law, which was perverted once, now function as it should, and let those who suffered innocently be freed from the burden of complicity they never deserved to bear." Sir Edmund nodded slowly. "I am prepared to face whatever consequences await. Indeed, I welcome them. The weight of this secret has been crushing. To have it finally lifted, even at such cost, is almost a relief." As we prepared to depart, Mrs. Dalrymple approached the magistrate. I thought she might reproach him, but instead she said quietly, "My husband's suffering is explained now. He knew what you had done, or suspected it, and it consumed him. I wish he had lived to see this day, to know that the truth would finally emerge." "I wish many things," Sir Edmund replied, "but wishes change nothing. Only actions matter, and mine have been weighed and found wanting." Holmes and I left the chambers carrying the precious documents, while the others remained behind to contemplate the revelations they had heard. As we stepped into the street, I turned to my friend. "It is a bitter victory, Holmes. Truth often is, Watson. But it is victory nonetheless. An innocent man's name will be cleared, and those who have lived in fear of unjust accusation will be freed. That must suffice." And as we made our way through the London twilight, I reflected that justice, though delayed and incomplete, was still preferable to the alternative of perpetual concealment. The past had claimed its accounting at last. Chapter 10. The Weight of Memory. The weeks following Sir Edmund Vailsby's confession brought a flurry of official activity that was, in its way, as exhausting as the investigation itself had been. Holmes delivered the recovered documents to the Lord Chancellor's office, accompanied by a comprehensive report detailing the circumstances of their theft and the original injustice they documented. I attended several of these meetings with him, and I observed that the officials who received this evidence displayed a range of reactions from genuine distress to bureaucratic discomfort at the prospect of reopening so old a wound. Sir Edmund himself faced no criminal charges in the end. The complexities of prosecuting thefts committed to conceal decades-old judicial misconduct proved too tangled for the authorities to pursue with vigour, particularly given the magistrate's age and voluntary confession. Instead, a quieter justice was administered. He was asked to resign from all his remaining professional associations, his name was struck from various honorary rolls, and a discreet investigation was launched into other cases over which he had presided. His reputation, which he had sacrificed so much to preserve, was thoroughly and permanently destroyed. The vindication of Robert Cartwright proceeded with more ceremony. A posthumous pardon was issued, accompanied by an official acknowledgement that he had been wrongly convicted on the basis of false testimony. The notice appeared in the Times and several legal journals, though it occupied only a few column inches and attracted little public attention. 25 years is a long time, and the world has little patience for correcting ancient mistakes. It was on a cold evening in early December that Holmes and I found ourselves once again at Baker Street, the case concluded and our professional obligations fulfilled. The fire burned brightly in the grate, and Holmes had taken up his violin, drawing from it a melancholy air that seemed to match the mood of the season. "You are contemplative tonight," I observed, setting aside the medical journal I had been reading without much attention. He lowered the instrument and regarded me with that peculiar directness which suggested he had been waiting for me to speak. "I have been thinking about memory, Watson, and the various forms it takes. We speak of memory as though it were a simple faculty, the mere retention and recall of past events. But this case has reminded me that memory is far more complex and far more dangerous than we commonly acknowledge." Dangerous? That seems a strong word. Yet appropriate. Consider what we have witnessed. Sir Edmund remembered his complicity and sought to erase the evidence of it. Miss Ashton remembered the alterations to testimony and hoarded her notes in secret. Penrith remembered the false date and allowed doubt to poison his peace for decades. Mrs. Dalrymple inherited her husband's memories of guilt and nearly destroyed herself attempting to ameliorate them. Each of them carried fragments of the truth, but memory, instead of liberating them, became a prison. He set down the violin and moved to his chair. "Memory suppressed does not die, Watson. It festers. It grows in power precisely because it is denied expression. Had any of them spoken 20 years ago, 15 years ago, even 5 years ago, the resolution might have been cleaner, the suffering less profound. But silence compounded silence, and memory became not a record of truth, but a source of fear." "Yet in the end, the truth did emerge," I said. "Surely that counts for something." "It counts for a great deal. But observe the cost. An innocent man died in prison. His sister died bearing the weight of coerced crime. Sir Edmund destroyed a career built on hollow achievement. The others lived in perpetual unease, never certain whether their silence was prudence or cowardice. And all of this because one young magistrate lacked the courage to resist pressure at a crucial moment." I considered his words in the firelight. "Do you believe he was entirely culpable? The pressure brought to bear upon him was considerable." Holmes made a dismissive gesture. "I do not traffic in absolution, Watson. Every individual possesses moral agency, however constrained by circumstance. Sir Edmund faced a choice between career and justice. He chose career, and that choice shaped everything that followed. The pressure was real, yes, but so was the choice. We diminish human dignity when we pretend that circumstances eliminate responsibility. A harsh judgment. Perhaps. But consider the alternative. If we excuse Sir Edmund on the grounds of pressure, we must excuse every official who has ever perverted justice for personal gain. We must accept that authority carries no corresponding duty, that power need not answer to conscience. I cannot accept that premise, Watson. Justice, however imperfect its administration, must rest upon the foundation of individual moral responsibility. Without that, we have merely the rule of force dressed in legal costume." He fell silent, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. The fire crackled and settled, sending shadows dancing across the familiar walls of our sitting room. "There is another aspect to this case that has occupied my thoughts," he continued after a moment. "The phenomenon of collective silence. Each of our principals knew something was wrong. Yet none spoke openly until circumstances forced the issue. They formed what might be termed a conspiracy of the conscience-stricken, bound together not by shared purpose, but by shared guilt and fear. They barely knew each other before this investigation brought them together. Precisely my point. They did not conspire in any conventional sense. They did not meet to coordinate their silence, yet the effect was the same as if they had. Each assumed the others would reject their testimony, would dismiss their doubts as imagination or self-interest, and so they remained silent, and the silence perpetuated itself across decades. What is the lesson in that? Holmes smiled faintly. That truth requires courage not merely to discover but to speak. That institutions, however necessary, cannot substitute for individual integrity. That the greatest conspiracies are often not planned but merely permitted to exist through the accumulated silence of those who know better. A knock at the door interrupted our conversation. Mrs. Hudson appeared bearing a card, which Holmes glanced at before nodding his assent. A moment later, Mr. Penrith entered, his bearing far lighter than when we had first encountered him. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he said, accepting the seat Holmes offered. "I hope I'm not intruding. I wish to thank you personally, now that the official matters have been settled." "You owe us no thanks," Holmes replied. "We merely performed the service you engaged us to provide. You did far more than that. You freed us all from a burden we did not know how to set down. Miss Ashton tells me she sleeps peacefully for the first time in years. Mrs. Lady Dalrymple has found a measure of peace regarding her husband's torment, and I—" He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I have been able to forgive myself, I think, for the silence of youth. Not entirely, perhaps, but enough to continue." "And Sir Edmund?" I asked. Penrith's expression grew sombre. "I visited him last week. He has removed to a small cottage in Surrey, away from London and the scenes of his former prominence. He spends his days, he told me, writing a complete account of the case for the deposit with the Law Society, a warning to future magistrates about the dangers of expediency. It is, I suppose, his form of penance. A valuable one, if it prevents even a single repetition of his error," Holmes observed. "There is one other matter," Penrith said, reaching into his coat. "The firm that employed Cartwright, though long dissolved, had assets that eventually passed to various charitable trusts. I have been in communication with the trustees, and they have agreed to establish a fund in Robert Cartwright's name, providing legal assistance to those who cannot afford representation. It seemed fitting that some good should come from this tragedy." "A worthy memorial," I said. After Penrith had departed, Holmes returned to his violin, but he didn't play. Instead, he stood by the window, looking out at the London night. "What are you thinking?" I ventured. "I am thinking that justice is a strange and imperfect instrument, Watson. We recovered the docket, exposed the truth, cleared an innocent man's name. Yet Cartwright remains dead, his sister remains dead, and 25 years cannot be restored. We have achieved what might be called resolution, but it is resolution tinged with profound loss. Yet surely it is better than the alternative. Better that the truth be known than forever concealed. Undoubtedly, truth is always preferable to comfortable lies. But we must not mistake truth for restoration. The past cannot be undone, only acknowledged, and acknowledgement, while necessary, does not heal all wounds." He turned from the window and met my gaze. "This case has reminded me why I practice my profession, Watson. Not because I can undo the harm that has been done. I cannot. Not because I can restore what has been lost. That is beyond any mortal power. But because truth, even painful truth, even truth that comes too late, is the foundation upon which any genuine justice must be built. Without it, we have only the appearance of order, hollow and unsustainable." "The vanished docket has been recovered," I observed, "and with it a measure of justice." "Yes," he agreed, "though the docket was never truly lost, merely hidden. Like the truth it contained, it exerted its influence even in absence. Memory, as I said, does not die. It merely waits, patient and inexorable, until the moment when denial becomes impossible and the past demands its accounting." He took up his bow and drew it across the strings, producing a note of such pure clarity that it seemed to fill the room with light. Then he began to play in earnest, a piece I did not recognize, but which carried within it both sorrow and something approaching hope. I settled back in my chair and allowed the music to wash over me. reflecting upon the strange case of the vanished court docket and all it had revealed about the nature of guilt, the burden of memory, and the redemptive power of truth. Holmes was right, as he so often was. Justice had been imperfect, delayed, incomplete. But it had been achieved nonetheless, and in a world where wrong so often goes unpunished, that was no small thing. Outside, the December night pressed close against our windows, but within Baker Street the fire burned warm and bright. The case was closed, the truth recorded, and the past, if not reconciled, was at least acknowledged. In the annals of Sherlock Holmes's investigations, it would occupy a modest place, remembered not for dramatic action, but for the quiet persistence with which my friend had pursued a quarter-century-old injustice to its bitter conclusion. And that, while I reflected as the violin sang its melancholy song, was precisely the kind of victory that mattered most, the victory of truth over time, of conscience over convenience, of light over the accumulated shadows of years. The docket had been found, and with it a reckoning that was long overdue,